Welcome to the Fly Fishing Insider Podcast, where each week we speak with brands, icons, innovators, and trailblazers within the fly fishing industry, exploring both the successes and failures they've encountered along the way to become who they are today. But first, if you have not yet subscribed to the podcast or joined our email list, please do so by going to the flyfisherinsiderpodcast.com, or you can also find us on Instagram at Fly Fisher Insider Podcast. Now let's begin. Today our guest is Mac Brown. Mac Brown is the owner of Fly Fishing Guide School in North Carolina. Mac has a long history in the fly fishing industry and many notable accomplishments, such as being an international master casting instructor and author of a casting book. Mac has focused teaching his craft and passing along his skills to newcomers wanting to get in the guiding business. Fly Fishing Guiding School offers students the very best of guiding opportunities to become a well-recognized and respected fly fishing guide. Mac, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Awesome. We're glad to catch up with you here. So let's just jump right into this here. Mac, tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your past.
Sure. I started fly fishing with my grandfather when I was a kid, and I never really thought when I was at university in mid-Missouri, that I'd work in this. And I guess the big change for me is after college, I went on the Appalachian Trail, hiked up towards Maine, and had a lot of time to think because it's about 2,200 miles long. So I had a lot of times to think about what I wanted to do, and I guess that's where the passion started to say, working what you love. And looking back, I don't really ever regret it. So, there's not really a degree in fly fishing when you're in college. I majored in economics. So that's kind of what kind of solidified it for me was after walking up there. I've been blessed to stay and working in my passion. So it's been a great journey.
Then what got you into professional guiding itself?
Probably demand. I live in an area of the country where we have the most visited national park in North America, and probably a third of the United States is within 8-hour drive of where I live. That would be the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. I was teaching kayaking and canoeing at the Outdoor Center. That's called Nantahala Outdoor Center. It's one of the largest whitewater instructional places in the world, and my county's made up about 90% government land. And we started some programs at the NOC that were fly fishing programs. They were incredibly popular, and the company wanted to specialize just back into whitewater. We used to do a lot with rock climbing, fly fishing, lots of outdoor recreation sports. And when they did that, and I thought, well, this is my opportunity. Nobody was doing it. So I started a delayed harvest program here in North Carolina on the upper Nantahala back in 1991. And we can explain more about what that means, but it's basically you plant greater fish than normal in an area, you have it catch and release for so many months, then you open it up to harvest. So the goal being you have a better place to teach. The other crowd's happy because they got a better place to harvest as well when those programs open up. So we put it on water that's going to be marginal water in that it might not support fish 12 months a year. So the river's really good in the winter, of course, here. And that way when it warms up, it serves a greater niche for a greater percentage of people.
Awesome. So how long have you been in the actual guiding business for, Mac?
I would say 1986 is when we ran our programs with the Outdoor Center, and by 87 there wasn't really anything going on in Western Carolina with fly fishing. And so I remember, it's kind of funny, I remember telling a lot of friends and the president at the Outdoor Center, this is what I'm going to do. So it's funny that a lot of people just kind of laughed, thought that would be a joke to take people fishing. Nobody thought that was a serious occupation. They all thought it was a joke. So what's funny about it, looking back, that's 32 years ago now. My county's $170 million economic impact in fly fishing now today. So I was just lucky that I jumped on the wave at the right time when the wave was just in the beginning of it starting to crest. And so a lot of it's luck and timing that society got really fired up about it more too. Fly fishing wasn't as popular in 1986, 87.
True enough, yeah. Mac, I know you wrote a book. I just want to touch base on the book. Can you tell the listeners what the book's about and specifically what the book's called?
Sure. The book was called Casting Angles, and I wrote most of that book when I was a teenager. Most of the notes and things in that book were before I ever started college. I guess the reason it was kind of important to me, it was basically about what I recognized on the water of the things, that I learned as a kid and teenager. When you go to look at like how the sport was being conveyed in the 70s and 80s, I kind of felt like like teenage years, that a lot of it was deception. And the reason I say that is it was mostly books were written about, well, if you didn't know what a Hendrickson or a certain bug was, then you weren't really going to be a fly fisherman. And kind of the older I get, the more I feel like a lot of that was deception. We've coached a lot with competition style angling with the Team USA youth kids, and
Hmm.
my kids are a good example. I haven't taught them a lot about insects whatsoever, yet they have the skill to go out and perform and do really well by learning technique. I mean, on the water and implementing strategies on the water of good decisions, and then of course casting and line control. So what I always saw the problem, even as a young kid, was people couldn't cast well. So I wrote a book that basically incorporates a lot of the kind of differences in casting, moving away from always straight line approach. And I think the benefit of that is talking about line control. We throw curves and we throw piles and we throw tuck cast and we learn to do all these things on the water because we're trying to dissect different currents on the horizon plus different currents that are going vertical when we talk about nymph fishing and wet fly. So the only way to do that is to become better and better at line control. And so it's kind of a whole different approach than what was around.
Sure enough. Yeah, it definitely set the trend, right? It stepped out of the box, and you did something different, and that's why it's so recognizable and notable. So here we are, Mac. Just to confirm, you're a guide. It's the early '80s. You've written this book. What's next? You start this guide school, or did you continue guiding for quite some
Well,
time?
I
Walk
started a
me through
college.
that.
I mean, I taught at a college program up here, associate professor at Western Carolina University, and that was a lot of fun back in the mid '90s. And a lot of those students, basically, there was one student in particular named Josh Stevens that was in that program. And before that, there really wasn't any kind of competition or anything that I knew of in North America. And Josh moved out to Colorado after college, and he made it. I think he placed first or second in the first nationals that was in California that he did. And he worked out there as a guide for about 5 years, and he kept in touch and he kept calling, telling me about the competition and going to world championships and things like that. And basically, what it did is when he moved back, that's where this became kind of the training ground for like the youth kids and a lot of the adult team North America. For Team North Carolina and North America became real successful. And then we just had a lot of people here that had a lot to bring to the table, and it was kind of like a hotbed basically because all these people that were passionate about being more efficient on the water, and so it kind of was a neat thing to be around at that time period in the mid '90s. So I would say the competition scene really came back because of Josh. But as far as talking about efficiency, and I look at it like when we teach this sport, I usually look at just break it down for somebody right up front and say, look, here's an equilateral triangle. There's strategy on one side. There's line control on another. Line control is not just casting, of course, also mending and what we do to enhance a drift, whether we want that drift to be 30 or 80 feet long. How do we pull that off? Of course, that's a kinesthetic skill that can be taught really easy. But then the other side of that is the tactics and technique that we use to get there. So the triad's always basically growing. You're growing with it your whole lifetime. But by trying to instill a foundation for that triad right up front to tell you what it is, I think that's a powerful thing. And then there are a lot
Hmm.
of good quotes, that I use over the years to help get that across. But the greatest strength, people will develop is their ability to recognize their own weakness. And I think that's a big part of why fly fishing is just so diverse. And there's always more. There's always more because then people realize they're weak at something. Do they want it or are they going to ignore it? That's really on them. Do they want to go there or not?
Definitely. It's spoken like a true teacher here. So, Mac, what inspired you to start the school
I think
itself?
just the years of being around like the outdoor center, we learned a lot about whitewater. We do trips all over the world, the outdoor center. And so I got to see a lot of places and realize the necessity of a lot of rivers we couldn't really get to without going down in a craft, like whether that be a dory or an oar frame raft. I mean, a lot of trips that I did, like down in New
Hmm.
Zealand, Tasmania, were always out of boats because that's the only way we could access where we wanted to be to actually fish it, to be remote. And the guide school, I mean, I love teaching the whitewater aspect of it. I love teaching the processes we go through to figure things out, which is back to that triad we talked about a second ago, with what the sport entails. And there's really a team. It's really a team
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
mentality when you have a student coach, student mentor type of atmosphere. You're just trying to lay the foundation. I mean, down for somebody, and I think a lot of that boils down to intent. So even today, I do a lot of classes. I'm off to Texas this next weekend to teach in Dallas, Texas for an advanced 1 day class. It's like 8, 9 hour class, and what makes somebody sign up for that? When you think about shows over the last 40 years, and you got 10 or 20 people in a class, what are they there to do? And I really think the biggest thing that I see that I think really benefits offering more specialized classes is we have to basically get down to the intent. What are we there to do? 90% of it when I was a kid was always somebody that just is showing you how to do one thing. It might be a pick up and lay down or whatever. So that's the intent, but that's not going to make you a great caster because you did one thing. Does that kind of make sense? I'm trying to look at the big picture and convey the big picture. And that's the problem that I see in the sport. Because when I travel, it shows I've been,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
this will be my 15th show this winter since January 1st. And what I see a lot of is people will have a class for 3 hours with folks, and all they've done is pick up and lay down cast for 3 hours. Is that really the great way to start? And I question that, and I say no. I think in a way it stagnates a lot of people because you didn't show them what they need to go away and practice. So kind of, I mean, I know it sounds kind of weird, but it's
Hmm.
like we're trying to talk about the understanding, and I think it's a difference. It's really a difference in approach. In other words, American education, since we were young, basically looks at, like, say, liberal arts, which is great. You get a whole lot of broad topics at the base of the pyramid. Down the road, you might specialize in something. And so it makes it easy to talk about a lot of things and then become a specialist in one little area. But I think in
Hmm.
casting, it's better to talk about the hard stuff up front. I mean, get it all out there, which is the understanding behind it, the mechanics. And if you notice, there's a lot of people that have attempted to do that the last 100 years. And it's usually like, here's my four things, just learn my four things and you're going to be a great caster. And I don't think anything works that way. That's the shortcut. Of course, the masses will jump on that the quickest and think,
Absolutely.
wow,
Yeah,
here's four
absolutely,
things
Mac.
that somebody said, and I'm going to just follow those. And that'll stagnate somebody really quick. So, what I'm trying to say is do the hard stuff up front, and everything else falls to place, and you have an understanding why it works. And some people don't want to do that. So, what I'm talking about is really not probably the most popular thing, but will it create much better students to become coaches themselves? You bet. And I mean, because they
Mhm. So
understand
that
this.
so then Mac, I guess my follow up to that is what would the like walk me through what a student would encounter. Like I get off the bus, I'm at your front door. Now what? Like walk me through what we would encounter, what we're gonna learn.
Well, we talk a lot about skewing the rules. Okay, what rules are there? I mean, there's not really any rules per se that are going to be ultimate rules or principles or fundamentals. There's a lot. We call that drinking the Kool-Aid a lot in this line of work with other instructors. They'll start reciting to me what something from 1970, and it'll be like a rule, like it's an ultimate rule. And I'm like, no, if the only rule would really be, I mean, what is the study of motion, which is what we're doing with when we fly cast.
Yeah.
And I've said this for years. I mean, Isaac Newton is the one that brings you calculus and brings you the three fundamentals of mechanics. So what are we really talking about? There's the three things about motion. Learn those three
Hmm.
principles of him. If you want to apply it to everything in casting, if you understand those three things, you understand everything in casting. So the problem is a lot of people go, oh, no, you're talking about math or something about kinetics, which is a study of motion. Why would I want to do that? It's a lot easier to read somebody's one liner. You know what I'm saying? So it's the wrong approach, is what I'm saying. The one-liners all end up breaking down. I mean, why do they break down? I'll tell you why. Because they probably weren't correct. Does that make sense? As far as when we talk about strictly
Yeah,
mechanics,
absolutely.
and it wouldn't be just in fly casting. I mean, it'd be in every other sport, golf,
Hmm.
baseball, lacrosse, whatever you want to talk about. I mean, if somebody was to teach those sports with one or two principles, I guarantee you they're going to break down as well because it's not going to be as simple as that. So we talk a lot about diagnostics for the student. The big thing is the word intent. Like, what are we here to do? The intent in the early stages, like I said, is to get an understanding. That means we're going to have to talk a lot about different understanding body motions, and that's the kinesthetic side of it to get a successful rod load. Not to say that we always want, I guess that's one of the big places where it starts, like people think, even rod load, oh yeah, I can load a rod. Well, the big part of that is let's just compare it to something like golf or billiards. What dictates a great billiard player is the ability to leave the cue ball wherever you want on the table. To do that means you're going to hit the ball every time with
Hmm.
a lot of different rates of acceleration. High center versus low and to the left on the cue ball. I mean, you're going to leave the ball for the next shot so you can run the table. That's what good pool players do all the time. That's going to make sense. So we're talking about not just a singular acceleration or how we move the rod to say we're always perfect. We're talking about how to do it to meet what? Intent.
Correct. Yep.
And so that means we have negative accelerations, which is a real simple concept. It's like take your foot off the accelerator in a car. You're decelerating. What part of that is hard to understand? I mean, I think even a kindergarten kid, if you explain it in the right way, you can get all these concepts across to anybody at all ages. They want to ignore it
Hmm.
at first, just show me the one way. So I think a lot of times students show up with, a thing, what they perceive it's going to be. And then you start talking about positive accelerations, constant accelerations, and negative accelerations. And that's how it's been explained in books and elementary school books for a long time. I mean, I don't think that's a difficult thing to clear up those fallacies. But then, well, there's a long list. I mean, on the website underneath the itinerary, you're asking me if student. I mean, it'd probably bore the reader, but there's like 35 things on there that address what you're asking me. You probably don't want me to read all 35 things, but I think that gives.
No, but if you could touch base, Mac, if you could touch base on a few of them, just so the listeners that aren't in front of the website can get an indication as to some of the offerings that you guys teach, that'd be great.
Yeah. All right. Well, Pantomime is when we use a motion to try to teach what we're going to do with the rod and line. So any motion that becomes more complex, that's more than one motion. So lots of times we make cast for curve cast and things by using what we call transverse waves, which means we're introducing a right angle component. Say we're throwing a cast forward, but now we're going to move the rod during that stroke, move it out and back, either that's to the left or right, perpendicular to the direction of travel. That's a good example of where we start to apply like three different accelerations to one. The fastest way to teach those kind of strokes or to have you do it with just your index finger. Just sit there and do it with your hand. If you can't do the motion with your hand, you're sure not going to do it with a rod and line. So a fast way in teaching what we'll use a lot is to pantomime anything that's more complex, and that includes even the basic foundational stroke. The basic fly casting stroke. If they can't pantomime it with their hand first, then chances are they're not going to do it with the rod and line. So it just makes life a lot
Hmm.
easier getting these things across. So we use a lot of that. We separate and talk quite a bit about what is necessary versus style, which is a concept Mel Krieger talked a lot about back in the 70s. And I think that's an important thing because the older I get, the more I realize really substance is in everything, which is talking about, the mechanics. And style is more about really talking more about ego. Because if you came to me and said, hey, this is my style and this is what I'm going to use for everything, then I'd say, well, you're probably wrong. Because I think styles are all limited with the same mechanics. And whether you like to cast it with your arm low or high, and then people say, well, that's because everybody's built different. I mean, what I would say too is learn them all. Learn them all. Because, I mean, the substance applies to all of them. It's not hard to practice all of them, right? Like for vertical or distance
Hmm.
cast, or you're going to a saltwater trip and you want to throw a 100-foot cast, then learn the style that's going to let you do that the easiest way.
So I also noticed, Mac, that you offer both single and double-handed castings at your school as well. So is that another aspect that you'd want to learn as well?
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, I like the two-handed casting a lot, and I mean, it's a lot of fun casting with two hands, and you can do a lot of things greater than what you'll ever do with a single hand because the distances you can reach. It just makes it a lot of fun.
How do you find the students like it?
If I lived up where you live in BC, I'm sure it would be even more popular. But the southeast, we don't have salmon rivers or anything around where I live to swing,
Mhm.
for that. But I mean, you can still use it for a lot of other species of fish. Like you can use it in the saltwater. You can use it for like smallmouth rivers and swing things much further distance. So it
Yeah,
makes life a lot easier for people. Like let's say they're older, older than like working with young kids. It's going to be a lot easier for them to reach greater distances off a two hand. So that just makes it easy. That once again, you're matching the gear to do what they're trying to do to make life easy.
absolutely.
There's versus putting, that's part of the class too, talking a lot about equipment and fly lines, fly rods,
Mhm.
leaders. All that dictates whether we make it easier or
Yeah,
more
100%.
difficult.
Yeah, the technology and that. Yeah.
Yeah, it changes it. And I think a lot of it is, I mean, I want to keep it positive, like talking about the things that, that we go over. But really, the biggest incentive when you ask me about the guide school, I would say, is the fact that I'm 55 years old. And what I see a lot the last 20 years, even though the sport's booming at the seams with more and more people jumping in, I see a lot of things that are actually more of a regression rather than a progression, like evolution moving forward. And part of that regression is, and you can't blame like the industry of retail manufacturers because they're going to do wherever the people, they're going to do whatever the people want. Does that kind of make sense? So the whole idea, like talking about two hand, I mean, first thing I thought of when you said that was Skagit.
Hmm.
Why is Skagit so popular? because with poor technique, perfect technique, or mediocre technique, Skagit's going to give everybody a big result.
Yep, you're rewarded. Yep.
What's
You're
that?
rewarded with with poor technique with the Skagit. Absolutely.
That's why I mean, yeah, most of the spay instructors that I know around the world that are really into spay are can't they're kind of anti-foe to Skagit. Why? Because they've spent a lifetime learning how to throw long belly lines, and it makes them feel good throwing beautiful casts with long belly lines.
Hmm.
Is it more difficult to learn? You bet. But to go backwards and say now we're going to put a line on that's 15 feet that works for poor technique or mediocre technique, we're kind of not getting to teach at the level we're wanting to get across. You see?
I do see. I understand exactly what you're saying. It's definitely a challenge, and I mean, I fish Skagit as well up here in the rivers in BC, and I'm rewarded as well with that. It's just how I was taught getting into it, right? You know what I mean? Like it's just one of those things. So
Right,
you're absolutely right. Have I ever thrown a long belly line? Not at all. So that's just how we were taught in the rivers.
right. Oh yeah, and the same thing in guiding. I mean, that's one thing about the schools that I love teaching is guiding. The same things happening all across America. Because I mean, I don't just stay here. I mean, I'm in Wyoming, Montana, Idaho every summer for about 20, 30 days, and it's like it's the same all over the country. What's happening in guiding is the same thing. Where you see everybody lobbing a golf ball 5 feet past the oar. When you get right down to it, lobbing a golf
No,
ball five
exactly.
feet past the oar is not like the guide really taught them anything about casting, is it? It's like same deal. So what I want to do is try to help turn that ship, right the ship to where we get people that actually teach people. That's what I think. Probably the best advice out of the guide schools that I'll tell people is like, first you have to recognize your genie. What do you want? What are you trying to bring? And if it's just to go out there and be another entertainment trip where you're putting a golf ball lobbing it 5 feet and then saying I'm a
So
fishing
then let
guide.
me ask you, Mac. Let me ask you, what 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 would you say the area that students find most challenging in your program is?
I think it depends on the people. Like this last week, we had 6,500 CFS of water. I just finished a school yesterday, and of course, some of them they're all different life experiences. For some of them, they were terrified to
Hmm.
get in water that big, because they're looking at the water. It's big, it's really fast. The road's underwater next to the river, and they're thinking, "Oh, this is like really
Yeah.
dangerous." And I'm like, "No, it's actually really easier because there's not as many things to hit." But so I mean, I would say if you ask them, I'm just thinking from what they tell me. I mean, some of them are like really relaxed with that, and some of them are really nervous. So you got to kind of tell them, hey, it's going to be all right. You got a rower with over 34 years experience in every one of the boats, so there's really nothing that can go wrong. The rower will take over if they're really
Uh,
going to mess up. Okay, I mean, if they're about to really
yeah.
mess up,
Yeah.
somebody else is going to take over the oars just for that one spot, and then put them back in charge. But then other people will say, that everybody learns at different rates kinesthetically, and some of them pick up most of the casting and the concepts really quick, and others are like still thinking, hey, this is difficult. So, I mean, I guess it's the same with when you teach golf or pool or anything else. So I think those are going to be different for everybody depending on what their past experiences have been. Some people are going to be naturally picking it up quick, and others are going to think that something you picked up quick might be more difficult. And I mean, there's a lot of different reasons for that. I mean, as far as how people learn.
Absolutely. Do you think the instruction or the instructors themselves, they have anything to do with that, or their role in that, on how they learn? And if you can you touch base on how you come to acquire your instructors?
Basically, what I look for, we talk about like, I mean, for years back in the '60s, a hot topic was always talking about right and left brain people. And what happens is there's a lot of good information on the internet people can read. I think that really helps as far as understanding like why certain things are the way they are. I guess what you could say is there's a lot of left brain thinkers out there, and if you just draw a big triangle that's more like a
Hmm.
30, 60, 90-degree triangle, and you draw it right through like a person's head and think, okay, the people that really like specifics and all the specific stuff is going to be just that little sliver of that triangle if you draw that right over a person like a center circle. And the real broad part of that triangle where it's really vast and it's like lots of broad things that come into play, those are your right brain people. I mean, that like to think a lot with the right brain, so they have an outlook that's different about accepting a lot of broadness first and then applying. But you want them to interconnect. In other words, when we look at things, if we learn to think with both hemispheres, of course, we
Yes.
can do things much faster. And so I think that's why, like what you were asking a minute ago, why do some people think it's hard to do an 80-foot cast? Maybe because trying to be too specific and not looking at the broad picture. That makes sense of putting
It,
all these
it,
things together. And I think that's always been the fascinating thing of teaching. Somebody asked me the other day at one of the shows, and I told him, I said, I don't know a lot. I mean, I've learned more from talking with lots of other global instructors. But as far as what I believe in casting, that was pretty well foundationally set at 16 years old. I mean, do I know lots of other things about casting as far as like what I can do kinesthetically? Probably not. I mean,
mhm.
I'm still. I mean, I've learned a lot of things teaching wise, but I'm saying my casting skill set is very, very similar to what I was when I was a teenager today. That kind of
Yeah,
makes sense. It's like what's really improved is like how do I compare that to you or to somebody else? And I think that's where I'm really going a lot faster rate because I'm thinking about that all the time.
I do have a question though, and I'm sure many of
Yep.
the listeners are wondering as well. How are the students graded? Is it a pass or fail, or is there a percentage you need to hit? Like how do you know?
No, it's it's mainly just to go over those skills, and you have a lot of question answer time at the end of all these things. And a lot of times, I think that's an important part of it because a lot of times the person that asks that, all of them are wondering that same thing. So at least it gets it on the table where you're addressing that. But it's not so much that it's not like what we do in the like I'm a member of the Fly Fishers International, and when we have those tests for like certified instructor or two-handed test or master test, they have a specific thing they're looking at to go through the test to make sure that
Absolutely, yes.
that
The,
somebody has it. So it's a
yeah, the
pass fail.
criteria.
Okay. But what I'm doing, I'm not there to give a pass fail. Like when you're coaching a youth kid or whatever, you're trying to get the kid to progress and get better and give them a good foundation. It might take them a couple of years to put it together. It might take him 10 years. It doesn't matter. He's getting a foundation that's putting him on the right foundation to start with. And I think that's all back to, the
True
individual
enough.
you're working with.
So I also know that you guys teach the business side of guiding to your students. Is this necessary for
We
them
talk
to
about
learn?
that in the evening just for the fact that a lot of them want to be independent. Probably 50% of the guide school people that come through are looking at retiring in a few years, and they just want to be a better angler. So they want to know like what is it that we do on trips day in day out, and it's basically we're solving problems. I mean, we're solving like a puzzle, a complex puzzle. And then after a while, that complex puzzle becomes a little less complex because we start to have these clues from observation that we use all the time. I mean, good example, they fish a lot of lakes up there in BC where you are. I love to fish lakes. We don't have a ton of trout lakes here.
Mhm.
I only have about 8 that are within 20, 30 minutes of the house. And you learn a lot of clues fishing still water, like when it's really bright blue sky. Are the fish up or down? Like I think any gilly in the UK could
Yeah,
tell you right away where the fish are if it's bright blue sky. But to the consumer, they're like, wow, that's amazing. You mean the fish go deeper when it's bright? And it's like all these things are just like common knowledge to people that have worked in that all their life. And so I think observation is a big part of that.
yeah.
And so you take all those observation clues. Are we going to start out with a floater, an intermediate line, or are we going to start out with maybe a 5-7 sweep? Does that make sense? So I'd say, yeah, start with a 5-7 sweep and put your flies deeper to start with, and let's see what happens. Now, if that fails, we can start reassessing. But there's just tons of observation that I think people that don't get to
You know
do
what,
it
Mac?
enough are always
I do
asking
want to. Yeah, I
fascinated.
want to ask you. So let's say I grad from guide school. Do you guys help with job placements, and how much can I expect a new
A
grad
lot
to
of them,
make right
yeah, a lot of them want
out
to
of the
do it.
gate?
To work for somewhere to get the experience. And I think that's a good thing. There's a lot. If you get with a really good shop that has a lot of educate. I mean, really good people at their job. I mean, that understand like those observations. They're going to pick up tons of little tricks, like what we were just talking about in observation, and that's going to help basically be an
Hmm.
education further down the road for them. Because they're getting to hang out with people that have put a lot of time in it already. And so then there's another benefit. I mean, the drawback to that is, you're working for somewhere that's going to keep a percentage. So then it just depends on the person. A lot of people want to do that and they're happy with that, and that's fine. And other people want to be independent. I think there's pros and cons to both. So I like I like I like both. I mean,
Absolutely. Yeah.
depends what they want. I mean, for me, like I say, there wasn't anything here, so by choice, I kind of had to be independent at the very start because it wasn't a thing being done in this part of the country at the time. And so I don't know. I think there's stages though for all that. Like you're talking, like when they go work for somewhere. One of the guys that I had last fall was one of the top like national sales trainers for. big company in high tech, and I learned some really good stuff. I mean, it's really
Hmm.
fun when you meet folks in life that have all this to offer, like of connecting with people and talking about the stages. And I'll just tell it to you real fast. I mean, one thing he was talking about, and I mean, I had this happen for one of the guide school things that came in the other day. I was looking, I'm like, the kid's 18 years old. And he's got on that. It's, we get a lot of different ages, anywhere from 18 to 65. This will be one of the younger people that's come through it over the years. And it's like he was already a perfect 10 and everything. So what this salesman broke down is he calls this first stage of everything is an unconscious incompetence. In other words, they're incompetent, but they don't realize it yet. You know what I mean? I think this is like, I mean, I've been there, you've been there, everybody in life's been there. And that's what it's back to that what we talked about in the beginning. Like the greatest
Hmm.
strength we'll ever develop is to recognize where we're incompetent. And then once you realize that, you're like, hey, you got all these facts and figures, and all of a sudden you realize, well, what do I do to get to that next level? There's only 4 stages. So conscious incompetence, when they realize they didn't know everything, and they're going to try to go get some training or something to figure out what do I do to do more. Does that make sense? And to do that, you have to admit. I mean, that's the first step. So just think about that of all the times you've been on the water with friends and buddies, and there's always that friend that's like, he's caught everything. Everybody else has got the same fly, same everything, and they're wondering, well, how come he did that? So they got to basically eat humble pie to the admission that they didn't know as much as they thought they knew in order to improve. That kind of makes sense. And then you get to that conscious competence state, which is like I was in this same state a lot in my casting abilities as a teenager, to where there's this light bulb comes on. But the problem is I'd still have to stop and think about it before I'd do it. I mean, that's the third level right here we're talking about. I mean, you can compare it even to educational system and talk about, high school
Hmm.
versus college versus master's or a PhD in education. So I think that's a really neat stage. But the fact that we still have to stop and think about the actions of what we're about to do and why we're doing it, it's not coming. The conscious competence stage is, I mean, you're still having to think. So they're still not the highest of levels, right? So there's a quote that Vince Lombardi used a lot years ago, and it says, perfection is not attainable. But if we chase perfection, we can achieve excellence. And I think that's the flow state, like Tiger Woods when he was on top of golf. People that don't have to think about it. And casting's the same way. Once we
Yeah.
get to that unconscious competence stage, it just happens because we look at something and we just do it because we've done it enough times in the past. And that's kind of the progression. Whether we're talking about the observations and what to do for making a strategy on a river versus how we're going to do the cast, how we're going to row the boat. I mean, it's everywhere. Once we get to that upper level of that, then all of a sudden we're just in the moment of doing it versus having to think about how we're doing
Yeah,
it.
I like that, Mac. What's one thing you would change within the fly fishing industry? And I always ask this question to my guests, and I'm dying to know that one thing
I'd
is
say the
from you.
biggest thing, if I was going to pick one thing, I would say the biggest thing right now is fly lines. I mean, because we're going off a system that's really antiquated and old. The whole idea that the first 30 feet of a line, I mean, that's just so archaic. To use that. I mean, where the 30 feet comes from is the same reason why in America we still have a mile instead of kilometers like you use in Canada. So just to throw that out there, I mean, why do we have 5,280 feet in America
Interesting.
for a mile? Is because the average Roman soldier at 5 foot tall for 1,000 paces walks 5,280 feet. What an archaic, ridiculous system, right? When I was in preschool, like in
Uh
1964. I
huh.
remember 65. They were all saying that, oh, we're going to the metric system, and I thought, great, that's going to be a lot easier for everybody to work with. Well, the same deal. Like, why is the fly line 30 feet? And it goes back to Snell's fish optics of refraction reflection laws. So let's take that same average Roman soldier at 5 feet standing on the shore. 5 times 6 is 30. That's where the 30 feet comes from. Then. Does that make sense? So that's where you're invisible. So the average 5 foot person fishing 30 foot away is invisible to the fish that's out there 30 feet away. Now think about that. We throw fly lines we pick up at 70, 80 feet a lot of times in saltwater.
Interesting.
What's going to happen when we're only getting half the picture of knowing the fly line weighs this for 30 feet? Who
Hmm.
cares? I mean, what's it weigh at 70 feet? What's it weigh at 50 feet? I mean, that's the stuff people want to know. So, I mean, I think a lot of the fly line stuff needs to be revamped from AFTA. And it's not just myself. I mean, this has gone on for years amongst instructors saying, yeah, that needs to get fixed. But who's going to fix it? Probably when AFTA can get all the fly line manufacturers together and make them come up with their own set of new standards, it'll be better.
Yeah, I very interesting. I like that. Kind of learned a few things there, Mac, for sure.
Oh, no worries. It's just it's funny though. I mean, because when we were kids, all the lines that would say, okay, fly lines measured at 30 feet, so they used to make all the weight forwards chopped down right at 30 feet. That was kind of ridiculous, because some people like to pick up at 40, 50 feet. So there should have been weight forwards 40, 50, 60, 70 feet. Now today, we see a lot of the line manufacturers have answered that, like with the new amplitude lines from Scientific Angler.
Yeah.
Brilliant, brilliant line. And I mean, the heads on those at a 7 weight are like 70, I think 73 to 74
Hmm.
feet. So what I mean is just in the last few years, you've seen the industry really embrace that and start making lines to match the abilities of what people are out there teaching and doing. And that just now really has been in the last decade where you're seeing these head lengths of much further for weight forwards.
Correct. The technology in fly lines is changing for sure.
Yeah, that's a good thing. I mean, that's helped a bunch, but I still think, I don't know, as an industry as a whole, I think the big thing lacking overall, to answer you though, I mean, lines would be my first thing.
Yeah.
But the second thing is, I mean, I believe a lot in education as far as teaching and conveying, wet fly techniques. I mean, these days I did a lot of wet fly presentations over the winter. The main reason I really like doing those, one, I fish that way a lot, but secondly, because a lot of these things that are the foundation tradition to our sport are disappearing at an alarming rate. But we're not seeing a lot of people let fly around the country. Most of them are tungsten, 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 and bobber, bobber, bobber. It's like, where's the sport going to be 50 years from now if we don't go back and talk about the roots?
Yeah.
It's that's one thing that makes me worried. So I like to talk about the things. Hey, this is where it came from, and it's still highly productive technique. I mean, that's where I guide most of the time using let fly techniques. During a hatch or something, I mean, you can do much more during a hatch by throwing 3 wet flies. You
I
know what I
do.
mean?
Yeah.
Than saying tungsten, tungsten. And so it's like, I think that's the big difference.
It,
Why over in Europe, a lot of Europeans are still using a lot of wet fly techniques, and in America, it's turned into, even that's changed from when I was a kid. People my age, when they were kids, they all started tying dry flies as kids. We tied all the traditional catskill and wolf style flies.
yeah.
Nowadays, kids start in a tail pheasant, Frenchie with bead, everything's a bead. And I'll be honest, I didn't even tie a nymph the first 5 years of my fly fishing career. I did all dry fly.
Interesting.
Not to say it's bad or good, it's just different, you see. It's different because I think most young kids tie mostly all nymphs nowadays when they start out. So that's flip flopped, you see. I don't know why, but it has.
It's quite nice. Mac, do you have anything to say before I let you go to the listeners?
No, I enjoyed it, and I appreciate you taking the time and asking. You had a lot of good questions to ask, and it's always fun talking about fly fishing. So I appreciate the opportunity.
No worries. I want to thank my guest today, Mac Brown from Fly Fishing Guide School, and I want to thank you guys, the listeners, as well. Thanks, Mac.
All right, have a good day.